Thank you for being here on a
Thank you.
wonderful afternoon in Jaipur. Thank you, David. You've flown all the way from London just for this.
Yes, my first time in India. I'm really thrilled to be here, so thank you for coming. Thank you.
So I'm going to go straight to the novel, his most recent one. I have it here. It's called You Are Here. It's a beautiful story. It's poignant and tender. It's about two people who are sort of in a slump in their lives. We have Marnie and Michael. They're both, one is 38 and one is 42. And they lost love, and they're kind of now wondering if they still believe in love. And thanks to a meddling friend, they embark on this journey, which takes them across the coast in the UK. And I'm not going to give away all the spoilers, but it's this great story of these two sort of misfit characters and them kind of finding each other and finding themselves in the process. So thank you, David, for writing it. It's truly a glorious book. I want to start with a sentence that comes very early in the book. It's on page 5, in fact. And it says, I, Marnie Walsh, age 38, of Herne Hill, London, am lonely. And I find that such a poignant sentence because it reminded me a bit of Olivia Lang's Lonely City, because that's also about loneliness. It's about being in an urban environment. And there's a certain stigma attached to loneliness, right? To admit to loneliness is to be a failure. We're all sort of worried about doing that, even though we've all been there ourselves. So I want to talk about creating a character like this and having this assertion very early in the book.
I think as a writer, I feel very much in two minds about solitude. I was talking to my Italian publisher the other day, and they said they didn't quite have the same distinction between solitude and loneliness. And for me as a writer, solitude is crucial. I spend most of my days sitting by myself, and I love it. And also outside of writing, I often, like Michael in the book, go on long solitary walks, and there's something about the experience of being alone that I find intensely valuable. And at the same time, I'm aware that as someone who writes love stories, often in a love story, loneliness is the thing that the characters must escape. It's the worst possible condition. It's the enemy. It's the thing you have to shed off. And I wanted to write about, particularly during COVID and lockdown, I was aware of my friends who weren't necessarily in relationships, who didn't have family, who didn't have children, about the way in which their solitude was heightened and exaggerated and underlined. And I wanted to write about that without making the state of living by yourself outside of a romantic relationship or outside of a conventional family relationship, to make that acceptable and unexceptional and not necessarily something to be fearful of, even though in the case of this particular book, there is also a curiosity and a desire about what it might like to be in a relationship, to be with someone. So the novel is about the distinction, I guess, between solitude, which is often can be a very fulfilling and enjoyable and valuable experience, and loneliness, which as I became particularly aware of during COVID, can be rather corrosive and alarming and frightening, but not unusual. I mean, I think as Marnie says in the novel, the state of living by oneself outside of a relationship is something that most of us will experience, perhaps for the majority of our lives. The idea of being in a long monogamous relationship for 30, 40, 50 years is far more exceptional than the experience of living alone.
You've adapted books like The Great Expectations and Tess of the D'Urbervilles. So I'm curious, do you think loneliness is something more pertinent to our century? Is it something that novelists are dealing with now more than before? I think previously also characters were always misfits, right? For any writer, a misfit is a good character. But do you think loneliness is something particular to writers of our time and to our generation?
Yes, I think so. I think the marriage plot means something slightly different now than it did in the 19th century. And, it's still, as I said, I read a lot of contemporary writers a generation younger than me, who write about relationships, the quest for a relationship, the whole business of online dating, which isn't something I've experienced, the difficulties of starting a relationship, what one wants from a relationship, with great insight, an insight that I don't necessarily have from experience, but it does seem to be something that's very much in the air, and something which lockdown and the experience of COVID has underlined, yeah. But again, I don't want to, often in a rom-com, it's a wonderful book and a fantastic romantic comedy, but a film like Bridget Jones gets great comic material out of the misery of being alone. And actually, that isn't the case with a lot of my friends who don't necessarily have a conventional romantic relationship. They're not living in this state of desperation or misery. So I wanted in this book, I guess, to explore that, to tread that line.
In One Day, of course, you have two very young characters. They meet in college, and then it follows them over 14 years. In this book, the characters are already sort of in middle age. So can we talk about the challenges of writing about love in these two different stages and what that meant to you?
Yes, I guess often I try not to write too directly autobiographically, but often there'll be a sort of a spur, a catalyst in my own life that will suggest a novel. One Day is a book that I wrote just at the point where I'd become a father and was in a long-term relationship, and I guess it was a kind of goodbye to all that. It was a kind of farewell to the stage of my life in my 20s and 30s where friendship and the excitement of starting new relationships and that whole tricky business of working out what you're going to do with your life was very prevalent, very, very much in my thoughts. And I wanted to write, as so often happens when you reach the age of 40, you ask yourself the question, how did I get here? And One Day is very much about that. How do you? It was about the unpredictability of the future, the way that friendships change the course of a life, that kind of thing. With this book, I wanted to write about, Marnie and Michael just so happen to be the ages that Emma and Dexter are at the end of One Day. So this is about the next stage, a stage of life where perhaps you're not where you expected to be. You're not necessarily a parent, you're not necessarily in a long-term relationship. Perhaps you have been and it hasn't worked out. Perhaps there's a certain dissatisfaction with your work, or a fear of how long the work might last, a kind of growing anxiety about the future. I suppose I feel comfortable writing about that material, even though the harsh truth is that I'm 20 years older than Marnie. It's not my generation at all. It's a generation below me. But nevertheless, I do feel, I felt that was an interesting time to explore. That time where there are all of these expectations of where you should be and what your life should look like and the success you should have in your professional life. And Marnie and Michael don't have that. And yet at the same time, I guess I had a very interesting experience with this book, of writing it at the same time as we were beginning to produce the Netflix show of One Day. And I started writing One Day 18, 20 years ago, a long, long time ago. And I guess I wanted to write this as a kind of counterpoint. One Day is a sort of panoramic multi-character novel. This is really effectively a two-hander. One Day is a sort of epic that covers 20 years. This takes place over the course of 7 days. And I liked that contrast. And I guess also, because the origins of this novel came out of the end of COVID, that sense of spring and of the world opening up, I wanted to write a novel that was quite self-consciously hopeful and optimistic. So it's definitely the happiest and the funniest book I've written, I hope.
You've also said it's the best book you've written from the 6.
I guess I've slowed down a lot. I found it very hard. When you start writing fiction, there are various hurdles you have to overcome. I was always wary of writing in the third person past tense, for instance. My first novel, like a lot of first novels, was written in the first person. There's something very immediate about writing in the first person. With the third person, you kind of need a tone of voice. You need an authorial voice. And I struggled very hard to get that until my third novel. And I guess I've taken, this is quite a short novel, it's 80,000 words, so my process is to write a first draft, to get feedback from just one or two people, and then to put it to one side, and then to physically write it again, to type it again to make sure that every sentence is just right and every word is just right. So it's definitely the most kind of highly worked. It sounds very vain to say it's my best novel, but it's very, very, very highly worked, line by line, sentence by sentence, to be as precise and as funny, specifically as funny as I could possibly make it. Whereas I guess with certainly my first 3 books, I know that there are passages which are a little bit first drafty. When you go to a literary festival and an author does a reading, I guarantee if you look at the text they're reading, they'll have edited it. they'll have scribbled all over it. You know, they'll have made changes. It's never really finished until they take it off you. And with this book, I wanted it to get it to a very kind of polished state. So I'm very, very proud of this. But I've also come to accept that, you know, often that there are two aspects to writing a novel. There's all the work you put in, all the care you put in, line by line, sentence by sentence. And there's another ingredient, which is how people respond to the characters and how they respond to the story and what emotional impression it makes on the reader. And you're absolutely in control of the first. You know, you really can work and work and work at a novel to make it as consistent and as polished as you possibly can. But there's absolutely nothing you can do about the second part. And so I've come to accept that there's no correlation necessarily between the amount of work you put into anything, really, a script, a novel, and the response. But thankfully, people seem to have enjoyed this one, so I'm grateful.
Talking about revision, you do a lot of back work for your characters, and I was reading that you've got 30,000 word bio sketches for your characters. So just to tell you a little bit, Marnie is a copy editor. She's very involved in the world of books, and Michael is a geography teacher. He loves the outdoors, he loves rocks, and he's this sort of rugged man you want to have a conversation with. He's very interesting, he's very off the earth. I'm curious about these sketches you do about your characters. So what kind of information goes into the sketches which might not necessarily go into the novel?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I guess as a kind of kid, I was always, whenever you see writers in films, they still do it now. Whenever they write a novel, they always type chapter 1 and they write the first sentence, the next sentence, and the next sentence. And that's never really been my experience of writing a novel. It's always been much more about accumulating a great pile of material and kind of searching through it for the thing that excites you. So my process now is certainly not to type chapter 1. It's to sketch, to do the equivalent of doodling for a long period of time. With this book, I knew that I wanted it to be about a walk. I knew that I wanted it to be a chamber piece, to be about two characters. I knew that I wanted it to have a kind of warmth and optimism and to take place in the spring. And that's pretty much all I knew. And then for a long time, I just sketched and sketched and sketched, wrote little paragraphs, little character biographies, ideas for dialogue. I do a lot of improvising of dialogue on the page, so how a conversation might go. Pages and pages and pages of it. I guess a lot of that comes from, I had a long but amazingly unsuccessful career as an actor. You know, I did it for a long time and did hardly any acting. But I did do a lot of kind of rehearsals and a lot of the training, and that whole business of building a character, of filling in biographical details, and then going beyond that and working out what the character's intentions are. A lot of that has been proved very valuable to me as part of the writing process. So I certainly spend a lot of time thinking about the physicality of the characters, their favorite music, what they're wearing, their tone of voice. There's a lot of, I'm embarrassed to say, a lot of speaking out loud at my desk. So that, for me, is a much more useful part of the writing process. I don't want to be too dogmatic about that, because I know lots of other novelists, start at chapter 1 and write very fluently all the way through to the end and hardly revise at all. But for me, it's much more about creating a great pile of words and throwing most of them away.
You have a lot of great dialogue in the book, which we'll come to, but you also are a man of the metaphor and of the simile, and you have numerous metaphors and similes, and I was curious. In fact, I downloaded the Kindle version, and I wanted to see how many likes you have in the book. But
I'm not going to do that.
I got no result. I tried every combination, but it gave me no result. But there were a few similes that I really liked, and I'm just going to read out a couple of them. And I think this also kind of tells us about the characters in the book. Michael looked like someone who'd spent a year filming puffins in the Hebrides. And Marnie's ex-husband looked like the least popular member of a boy band.
Yes.
So I'm just curious about how you come up with these metaphors and similes. Are you working them in your head all the time? Are you looking at me and are you comparing me to something?
No, I promise you, I'm not doing that. But it is true that you don't really stop. And I mean, again, with this book, I wanted it to be line by line as funny as it could possibly be. And in real life, that feeling you have of leaving a party and coming up with the perfect witty joke that you should have made, and it's too late, it's gone. Well, when you're a writer, it's not too late. You have 3 to 4 years to accumulate these things. And so, when I wrote my first novel was a lifetime's worth of anecdotes and observations sort of crammed into 350 pages, which is why it gets much, much harder after that to be as amusing. You're kind of like someone at a dinner party who's run out of stories. And with this book, I guess I always have a way of, if I do think of a little observation that fits, a way of jotting it down and working it in. The danger is that you overwork it and it becomes like a stand-up routine rather than prose, and I do try and be quite sparing. But the joy of observational humor, I suppose, of similes and metaphors like that, of little quirks and little jokes that the author is making to the reader, is as a screenwriter, I can't do that at all. There's no such thing as a simile or a metaphor in a screenplay. If a character has a kind of sharp, shrewd observation about the other person, unless they can say it out loud, it's useless. So the pleasure for me of writing fiction as well as scripts, rather than scripts, is this opportunity to convey an inner monologue that might sometimes be witty and shrewd and observant. I mean, Marnie is, I hope, the funniest character I've ever written. She's a copy editor. She has a very attuned sense of language, and she's very observant and very precise in her speech. And it was a real pleasure to spend 3 years with her and make her as funny and sharp and precise as possible.
How has your experience, or your background as a screenwriter and actor, helped you in creating dialogue? You just said that you are often mumbling to yourself. Are you saying the dialogues out loud? And you also mentioned how, for Marnie especially, you wanted her to be funny, you wanted her to be witty. So are you imagining an actor playing that role already, or not really?
Yes, never a specific, I don't cast it formally, there isn't a specific single actor, but often it helps me to think, well, this is there's a kind of Jack Lemmon rhythm to this, or this is the kind of Katharine Hepburn role, that sometimes an actor, I love actors, and again, another reason why I love screenwriting is the opportunity to work and observe and collaborate with actors, because they can do so much. When you adapt a book for the screen, you immediately lose that inner monologue, and a novelist can very easily say the character said this, but they meant this. When you turn that into a screenplay, all you have is what the character said, and what you hope is that the actor will provide the underlying meaning. And I see that all the time. There are moments in the Netflix one day when Ambika will do something with her eyes that just suggests a page of prose. And I love being able to slip in and out of both. But on the page, I do want to give a sense also of performance. So I'm very careful with punctuation, with the difference between a dash and a ... You can, as a writer, stage a scene of dialogue very effectively by deciding when to put in the description, when to put in the stage movements, when to pause the dialogue and go into interior monologue. So there is a way of providing a rhythm and shape to a page of dialogue that I really, really love doing. It's the part of writing fiction that intimidates me, I guess, the least, because I'd sort of been doing it for a long time in screenplays and before that as an actor. It's definitely the happiest part of the process for me.
Is it the version that you revise the least? Do dialogues just come more organically? Yeah.
The dialogue tends to stay the same pretty much. It just gets tightened up. That's the other frustration with screenwriting, is that there's always a desire to make things shorter. No one's ever handed in a script and been told that this needs longer scenes or more dialogue. It's always about being very succinct, and I don't think novels should drag or be self-indulgent or kind of wallow in the wittiness of dialogue that doesn't do anything. Always there's a voice. With screenwriting, there's always a voice in your head saying, what does this do? What is this for? Because it costs so much money to make it. A minute of a script, it has a very tangible physical meaning in terms of the demands it makes on a budget, on the crew, on the actors. So there's always a desire to tighten things up, which doesn't exist in the same way with prose. There's no real difference between a 300-page novel and a 250-page novel. But for me as a writer, I'm always trying to just tighten things up and make sure that I don't repeat myself too much, that I don't make the same character point over and over. often with a first draft, you're so insecure about a first draft that you will overstate the character's qualities, so that it becomes the kind of written equivalent of overacting. You know, this character is neurotic, so everything they say or do is going to be neurotic. And the pleasure of revising a manuscript for me is just paring that down and sort of providing a kind of a more rounded performance on the page, if that makes sense.
I want to move to another very crucial part of the book, which is the outdoors.
Yeah.
And of course, Marnie and Michael, they meet not at a restaurant in the conventional way, they meet on this walk. And this walk in the outdoors and the brutal British weather plays a fundamental role in molding their relationship. So you've done this walk yourself, I know.
Yes.
So can we talk a little bit about why you like it? And even though you can be wet and miserable and soggy.
Oh yeah, no, you have to be wet and miserable. I mean, I about 10 years ago, I used to go take my kids on walking holidays, and they got to the point where they started to have a social life, and they really didn't want to go walking in the rain with their parents anymore. And so I started going by myself, and this corresponded, it was about the time my father died, and I found that my instinct was to just walk, was to just leave the house and walk. And my first long walk by myself was up the Northumberland coast from just north of Newcastle all the way up to Berwick on the borders. And it was an incredible experience for me to spend that much time, only 4 days by myself. And so it became a tradition, something that I did every year, just getting an early morning train to somewhere, usually in the north of England, and literally stepping off the train and walking for 4 days, staying at pubs or B&Bs along the way. And I mentioned this to my publisher, and they said, well, maybe there's a non-fiction book in that. Maybe you could write about solo walking. I didn't really want to do that. And at the same time, writing fiction about it presents all kinds of problems, because so much of fiction is about friction. It's about people arguing and not getting on and then getting on. And so it felt like it needed to be a two-hander, which led to the question, which walk? So very briefly, the coast-to-coast walk, which is the walk that Michael and Marnie end up doing, starts in St. Bees on the west coast of England, a small town on the west coast of England. And it's a 200-mile walk devised by Alfred Wainwright in the 70s as his preferred way to cross the country. So you go through the lakes. The first 4 days are in the Lake District. Then you climb up over the Pennines, through Westmoreland, over the Pennines, into the Yorkshire Dales, which is softer and very lovely, and long river walk. And then there's a very boring, bleak, dull stretch before you climb again onto the North York Moors and then down the Yorkshire coast. And the tradition is you're meant to pick up a pebble in Cumbria and carry it all the way to the sea at Robin Hood's Bay and cast it into the sea. So it seemed to me that there was a lovely kind of symbolism in that. It was the right length. It's a very varied walk. You know, you have the beauty and the splendor and the rain, torrential rain of the Lake District. And it was almost as if the 3 acts of the walk matched the 3 acts of the novel. So I went and did the walk by myself, making notes along the way. And it was almost like engaging in a kind of improvisation with the landscape. You know, you find an exquisite mountain lake and you think, well, what will Marnie and Michael do here? Will they swim? Will they try and swim and fail? What will they do in this terrible B&B? I mean, they're all made up, I promise. But there was an element of kind of improvising in location that I really, really loved. So this was an incredibly pleasurable book to write, because it was a chance to write about something that's very important to me and something that I love, but in a fictional form.
You mentioned the tradition of picking up a pebble at one coast and throwing it into the other, and Michael does that. Do you have any personal traditions that you follow on the walk?
No, I'm making it sound like I'm really not any kind of rugged explorer. You know, these are very well-trodden paths. It's very hard to walk anywhere, really, in England and not see other people quite frequently. You know, you can nearly always hear the buzz of a motorway unless you go to very specific spots. So I listen to a lot of music is the main thing I do. I download lots of music. It's not all birdsong and the elements. Often it's quite an artificial experience. Often I'm responding to emails in the middle of a field in the North Yorkshire Moors. So, but I do love it. I always bring a notebook. My editor gave me a notebook that you can write on in the rain. And I've never taken it out of my pocket. I've never used it at all. I just take lots of photographs as a kind of aid to memory and write when I get back to my desk. Yeah.
You mentioned you listen to music, and of course, Marnie and Michael have this little game where they listen to each other's playlists. They exchange each other's playlists, and the rule is they cannot skip a song. So can we talk about why you decided to do that? And I guess it's something that any couple does early in their relationship as well, right? You think you are sussing out the person with their playlist, but it's actually not true.
It's not true. No, there's a scene, a chapter in One Day where Dexter finds a compilation tape that Emma has made him back in 1988, and music, is obviously a very obvious way into nostalgia, into thinking about the past, but it's also something that in the present we quite often present to other people. It comes up very early on. What is your favorite film? What's your favorite song? What's your favorite food? Those kinds of conversations. And having done that in One Day, I thought, well, I don't want to do that in this book. What I want them to do is to present not the cool songs, but all the songs, the kind of highs and lows, the best and the worst. So the game that Marnie plays is that they swap phones and they have to listen to everything and they're not allowed to skip. So inevitably, it's not their favorite songs. It's the darker corners of their souls as well. So it just seemed to me it was the right stage of the relationship. It happens just before they both start to recognize the potential of a romantic relationship. And it almost acts as a way of them saying, look, I'm not just going to show you the best stuff. Here is all this other terrible stuff as well. And it felt like it was a really nice scene to write. I mean, I wrote, obviously there are only 5 songs in the novel, but in my notebook there's 20. Just putting on a record and having the characters riff about it felt like a really nice way also for them to talk about other things, to talk about the past and their first boyfriends and sexual experiences and things that they wouldn't necessarily offer up without this spur. So it was a fun game, both for me as a writer and for the characters on the page.
Another thing I liked a lot about the book, and especially maybe in contrast to One Day, in your 20s, the chances of you meeting your partner, it happens in university, right? You're all of the same age, you have similar interests. And as you grow older, it just becomes harder to meet like-minded people. And I think this novel brings that out beautifully about how in your 40s, forget about love, but even making friends is much more difficult. And I think at one point, you even mentioned how the one title that you were toying with was Walking and Talking. And I think in this novel, that comes out really well about their union or their connection happens on this big hike. So can we talk a little bit about, walking and talking?
Yeah, I guess that, again, it came from my experience of lockdown, where I found it very hard to talk to people suddenly. I'd always really felt that I had a very active and healthy and full social life, and then we all got locked away, and it felt as if, obviously then it became illegal to spend time talking with your close friends, and even when all of those restrictions were lifted, I didn't quite lose that feeling of anxiety around conversation or going to a party. I became extremely antisocial, and I wanted to, I guess, in my own life, rediscover the pleasure of conversation with friends and connection. There's a particular quality you have to conversation when you walk. It's almost like a therapist couch. You're not looking at each other, you're not eating or drinking, you're just kind of free associating as the day goes by. And so it felt like I liked the idea of these characters spending 6 or 7 or 8 hours just revealing themselves to each other. And I guess I also wanted to show these characters making a journey from, there can be something quite comforting about spending that time by yourself. And if you feel lonely, you just reach for your phone and you go onto, social media. And I find myself that if I ever do have a little twinge in the back of my neck of loneliness, that I reach for my phone. And of course, what you're getting from social media is, as the name suggests, almost a kind of parody of social relationships, of friendship. So the novel is also about these two characters rather nervously rediscovering their voices and rediscovering the value of self-revelation and of the pleasure of making someone laugh and gradually revealing things that they haven't necessarily shared. And so I wanted to celebrate that, which is why so much of the book is in dialogue.
I want to step back a little bit, and again, going back to the writing process, and since Marnie is a copy editor, she has a very good definition of what editing is, and that is, let the author know they have spinach in their teeth, which I thought was very apt and very appropriate. Have editors served that purpose for you? Have they told you you have spinach in your teeth?
They do, yes, lots of spinach. And I guess I'm really grateful for it. I think authors don't necessarily always acknowledge how collaborative the process of writing fiction is. Again, it's always portrayed as this solitary business, and then the book comes out. And actually, I do, 2 substantial rewrites and 3 or 4 very small detailed rewrites, and then they're copy edit. And a copy edit, just to explain, is somewhere between, it's not quite proofreading, it's not quite editing. It's taking out all the little kinks and trips that you, the reader, have as you read the finished novel. All those things, lines that don't quite work or don't quite land or are too repetitious, close repetition of words, that kind of things. And so I always take those notes and always value them. Very occasionally I'll say, no, I want to keep it like this. But I have a wonderful editor, Fede, who gives me a combination of very big notes, like, you need this, the first 10,000 words are a little slow, make it 6,000 words, and very small notes like, I'm not sure about this joke. And I take on nearly 90% of them. It's a different experience with screenwriting because often the notes are not being given for the best artistic reasons. Often they're to do with, say, an actor's uncertainty about saying a particular line, or because the money isn't there, or because the running time is too long, or because the scene is too expensive to shoot, or because it involves a child and they can't afford to use a child, and a child actor, and all of these things that are external to just words on the page. And so that can be a little bit more combative. And it's also combative at all kinds of different stages. You have the arguments about the script, then you have a second set of arguments with the people who've commissioned the script, because they might want it to be something other than what you want it to be. Then there are conversations with the actors, which are often, in fact, nearly always, I think, very healthy. But then there's the editing process, where quite often you will radically change what you had on the page in ways that you could never have anticipated because of a performance, or because of the way a certain scene was shot, or because of something that happened somewhere else in a different episode that plays differently. So that rewriting process is much more fraught and can be very, very, very stressful. But it's the major distinction between the two tasks: the collaborative nature of screenwriting and the more solitary but still gently collaborative nature of writing fiction.
I want to pick on something you said. You said you accept 90% of the edits. What is the 10% you're most protective about?
Oh, that's interesting. I guess sometimes it'll be a joke. Sometimes humor is subjective, and sometimes there'll be something that I think is funny that the editor really doesn't like. But most of the time I listen. Occasionally you'll do something deliberately, like a repetition of a word or repetition in a dialogue for a purpose that you believe will land with the reader. I mean, it's probably more like 95%. When you get a copy edit back, it's a Word document now, and that you can just press a button that says accept all changes. And then it would just go to the copy editor's version. And you would probably never notice. You probably never miss anything. It would probably be just instantly much better. But I do go through one by one and nearly always accept everything.
You mentioned you're possessive about your jokes. You've always been attracted to the comic. I think even soon after college, when you were in university, etc., it was the comic that attracted you. Who were some of your icons, and what attracts you about the comic?
Oh, as a young reader, I was very influenced by writers like Victoria Wood and Sue Townsend. Adrian Mole is a kind of core book for me. Dickens, I love Dickens. I love the way that Dickens could write, could switch very quickly between the comic and the serious. So Dickens is another touchstone for me. And I think I read him at the right stage. If I was coming to Dickens for the first time now, I wouldn't love him quite as much as I do. But he was very, very important to me. Great Expectations is a book I go to all the time. And Great Expectations, the story will quite often stop so that Dickens can take us to the theatre for a comic set piece that serves no purpose except to be as brilliantly funny as it can possibly be. And I love that about Dickens. On TV, Monty Python and all that British comedy of that era. But at that stage, I had no anticipation or even. I mean, the idea of being a writer really didn't occur to me. And so the only outlet for that passion that I had for comedy was performing. And I was not a natural performer. So I was very grateful later in life to be able to put it on the page. But certainly, yes, I would include Sue Townsend, Alan Bennett, Victoria Wood, Dickens as my kind of comic touchstones. Yeah.
You had a stage name as well, isn't it?
I did. There's quite often, if you see the film Gladiator, there's a massive guy with a beard playing one of the gladiators who's called David Nicholls. And he gets a lot of work as heavies, as gangsters and Vikings. And when I joined the Actors Union Equity, I had to change my name. So my stage name was my mother's maiden name, David Holdaway. But it didn't get used very much. I have one film credit as David Holdaway. There's a film by Stephen Frears called The Deal, which is about the Gordon Brown, Tony Blair relationship. And at some point, a TV floor manager puts their head around the door and says, "Ready when you are, Mr. Mandelson." And that's me. And that's the only thing I ever did on screen. And occasionally, when I've done film stuff, they've said, "Do you want a little cameo?" And I used to do it. In the film of One Day, there's a bit where Anne is talking and someone walks down a spiral staircase just over her shoulder, and it looks as if they've never seen a set of stairs before, and they're gripping onto the handrail and walking very carefully and doing too much, and that's me as well. So every time I put myself in the scene, I ruined it and caused problems in the edit. So in the Netflix One Day, there was a small role for someone who just had to open a door and say, "Didn't this used to be a fish shop?" And I was offered that role, but I turned it down.
I think the fact that One Day has become a movie and, of course, a hugely successful Netflix series tells us about how the book worked, how the novel worked, because, I think it had enough meat, it had these characters who audiences have just fallen in love with. But I find that there's this romantic comedies are often disparagingly called chick flicks. Yeah. And I'm a huge believer in chick flicks, but I just wonder, do you think it's unfair to see these films or these books as something that only women are interested in?
Well, certainly I've been really encouraged, particularly with this later book, that it seems to have had a great many male readers. It's true that a book like, when I used to do events for One Day, it was nearly always a 90% female readership, 10% male, but that's kind of evened out. And I guess in my own work, I've tried to still write about love and relationships and family and all of those things that are sometimes disparaged as being not serious literature. I've tried to write about them from both male and female points of view. So the novel I wrote after One Day, Us, is a first-person male point of view, as is Sweet Sorrow, which is very much about a teenage boy's experience of first love. And gradually it's shifted a little. It's probably still 70-30. But, I have found particularly with this book, because of Michael's particular experience, without giving too much away, Michael hasn't been able to become a father and is struggling with infertility and the factor that has played in the breakup of his relationship. And I've had, a great many very touching and personal and open messages about that, which I've very much appreciated and been very touched by and grateful for. So I guess I hope that's changing. And certainly it's something when I set out to write a book, I'm neither thinking, I'm finally this is the one that's going to reveal the great pain that lies inside every man, nor am I trying to kind of I'm not preempting the readership in any way. I'm not stereotyping or anticipating what certain people will like and others won't. So I just try and write as openly and frankly as I can. Yeah.
Wonderful. I think we'll move to the readers now. Any questions? Do raise your hand and we'll get the mic over.
Is this one in the front
row?
row?
I can see, yeah. Oh, lots of hands. Excellent. Sorry, the
Do you
mic
want
is
to
just coming.
Oh, it's,
One.
here it is.
There's
Is
a
there
lady in
mic?
the front.
Oh, yes. Hi.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Shrila Singh. What I wanted to ask you is like, I loved in one day.
Sorry, can you hold your mic close?
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Hi,
Yes.
I'm Shrila. So I loved how in one day you basically, it was a story of hope, right? In a lot of ways, the characters, they find a way to be close to each other. And I feel like in a lot of contemporary books, like for example in Sally Rooney's books, there might be hope, but I feel like it's the effort to make things work, the effort to chase love, to find love, that seems to be decreasing in contemporary fiction as well. Do you think that's a reflection of our times? That earlier we were writing stories about making that great leap of effort for finding love, and that seems to be decreasing as our society gets more and more disjointed.
Oh, well, it's an interesting question. I don't know if I'm either as widely read or I mean, it's a huge question, I guess. My own feeling is, I said in an interview quite early on when I was talking about this book that I'd probably never write another romantic comedy or I'd never write another love story. And I guess that comes from my sense as someone who's in their late 50s now, that whole experience of finding someone, of going out into the world and hoping to find a partner and what we hope from that, and whether it's a myth or whether it's a fruitful pursuit, isn't something that I have a first-hand experience of anymore. I think it's changed so much when I look at my own children's experience of love and relationship. It isn't something I feel I've lived through anymore. And that makes me anxious about perhaps being too dogmatic or decisive about exactly the kind of question you're asking, which is a fascinating question. So this is a really fuzzy answer. I guess for me, as a writer, I find it endlessly important and endlessly interesting. And I do try to be hopeful. And I guess I would also acknowledge that when we did the recent one day, it struck me that although it is a love story, it's very much a story about friendship. And however we feel about love and romantic relationships and the difficulties they involve, that value of friendship and communication and the way friends lift each other up and alter each other's lives is something that I do still very confidently believe in. So I guess I'm very happy to keep exploring that. You know, it's a large part of Michael and Marnie's relationship as well. It is a love story, but it's also about a bond that grows between two people through communication. And I don't think that alters. But I think the whole business of love and relationships in the modern world is undoubtedly complicated in ways that I didn't live through. I make it sound like some sort of the Second World War or something, but I'm more and more aware of a generational difference that is fascinating, but which writers who I hugely admire, writers like Sally Rooney, who are a generation younger than me, write about with such insight and clarity and curiosity.
Thank you. The gentleman at the back.
Hi, Nicole.
Hi.
My name's Noel.
Hello.
I want to ask you a very simple question. You talked about solitude and you talked about loneliness. I have this friend who lost his wife 25 years ago, and he was left with a 4-year-old daughter. He never married again. He never entered into short-term or long-term relationships. He devoted his life entirely to upbringing his daughter. And today I can say that he's done what he set out to do, and she's a career woman now, and she's a successful woman. She's been taken care of totally without a mother. And in all of this, where do you find that man, lonely or in solitude? How do you describe that? Because, you know, you've got me very confused.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, you've got me very confused.
Well, I guess I would suspect that the only person who could answer that would be the gentleman himself. I'm sure he had moments of loneliness, and I imagine there were also he must have thought that there was a value in his solitude as well. And I guess the distinction, the most important distinction between the two states is choice. You know, to choose to withdraw and spend time by oneself for a particular reason is a wonderful thing. But to crave company, to crave communication, to crave contact, physical or emotional, or just on a day-to-day domestic basis, is a very different experience, I guess, and not necessarily something that's chosen. So I imagine that choice would be the distinction.
In this case, it was chosen.
Yeah, well,
he didn't want to give his daughter a stepmother, and he sacrificed his life and his everything for her.
Well,
he decided that this is what my life is going to be, in spite of whatever society says. How are you going to bring up a young girl as a man, as a single father?
Thank you. Let's stick to one question.
That's the question.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Man,
Thank you.
Yeah, there's another person in the front. Thank you.
Oh, it was you. I see. Oh, you were the gentleman. Oh, well then. That's. Thank you very much for the question. Thank you. Well, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm
Hello.
Shobh.
Hello.
So basically, my question for you, for your movie in Netflix, so what was your best part and your part which you hated the most?
Oh, well, you know, I would struggle to find a part I hated. It was an extremely happy experience for me. I was asked very early on if I wanted to write it, and I felt that, you know, the novel felt like it had been written by someone else a long time ago. So I was very happy to hand it over. And working with Nicole Taylor and her team of writers, that was very, very happy. I loved the cast. I loved them both, you know, off screen and certainly on screen. I thought they did an incredible job. It was lovely to see the book changed. You know, often when adaptations happen, there's this war set up between the author and the people who do the adaptation. And we found a way to collaborate that was extremely open, frank, honest, not without conflict, but entirely respectful. And I've never really had that before in such a happy way. And all of it was good. The hard bit was, all the way through, I kept thinking, you know, surely they're going to ask me to write an episode. You know, these are my characters, this is my story. They can't just take it off me. And the call never came until quite late into production, where they said, we're running out of time. Would you like to write episode 13? Which Nicole was a bit wary of. So I took that on board. And it was wonderful to write for characters who I hadn't written about for such a long time, and to write them with actors' faces, because by then we'd cast Leo and Ambika. So to write new dialogue, because there was nothing in the novel I could really use, to write new dialogue for wonderful actors in the present day was fantastic. And the hardest part was getting notes, and the second hardest part was realizing that it's a period novel now. That actually, there's the same difference between 1988, when the novel starts, and 1953, the death of Stalin, as there is between now and 1988. Time accelerates as you get old, and going back to seeing people recreate 1988 as if it's the distant past was very sobering, but also kind of joyous in a way, really, because my daughter, who's 16 and who really hasn't no idea what I do every day, finally got a sense of what I've been writing, and I think also, hopefully, for a younger generation, a sense that those questions of what do we do with our lives, and how important friendship is, and how chance and fate can alter the course of a life, and how overwhelming that experience can be. That's something that their parents experienced as much as they're experiencing it now.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for being
questions.
a wonderful audience. Do get the book. It's about connection and company. David will be signing books, so please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.